Welcome back to Carneades.org. Today we're going to be continuing with our series, Dumbfounding Definitions, Dizzying Distinctions, and Diabolical Doctrines, a series sorting through some of the jargon of philosophy. In this video, we're going to be looking at analyzing African philosophy, continuing that mini-series, specifically focusing on what is Ethiopian philosophy. Now, Ethiopia is unique among sub-Saharan African countries for a range of reasons. It was one of the few countries to never really be colonized in sub-Saharan Africa, with the exception of a short period of Italian rule in the 30s that looks more like an occupation before and during World War II than colonialism in a broad sense. And that lack of colonization leads to some oddities, such as the Ethiopian calendar being 7 years behind the Gregorian calendar. So it's now 2012 there instead of 2019. And the fact that they start counting the time of day at dawn, not midnight. So 12 a.m. is around 6 a.m. in other places in the same time zone. Ethiopia is also one of the few African countries to have a pre-colonial written language, Geats, which I probably pronounced wrong, a predecessor of languages like Amharic and Tigray, which are present today in Ethiopia. Because of this written language, Ethiopian philosophy is particularly unique amongst ancient African philosophies, as it is not the product of ethnophilosophy. It is actually written down. So we have written records of 5 books of Ethiopian philosophy, dating back to the 5th century A.D. The earlier 3 books, the Physiologue, the Book of the Wise Philosophers, and the Life and Maxim of Carneades, are adaptations of Greek works, which have their own merits, but aren't fully original works. They're adaptations for the Ethiopian context. So fascinating that we have philosophy going all that way back, but not unique and original Ethiopian works. To get there, we have to move up to the 1600s. The other 2 texts that we have from pre-colonial Ethiopia, the treatise of Zara Yacob and the treatise of Walda Heywat, are original works of Ethiopian philosophy dating back to the 1600s. Heywat was the student of Yacob and expands on his work to the point that some have claimed that this should be considered a single text, sometimes referred to broadly as the Hatata, or inquiry. While the 2 authors present their case in stylistically different ways, Zara Yacob presents a lot of stories, whereas Walda Heywat digs more into kind of the argument side and expands on some of the very specific points that Yacob brought up. The arguments and positions are broadly the same. Heywat really just built on top of the framework that Yacob had built. And based on the ideas of Yacob, so I'm going to focus on Jacob's work here. But a lot of these ideas can be found in Heywat as well. So they're very similar. We're just going to talk about Yacob for now, but I recommend that you read it. It's pretty short and very interesting. Now, Jacob's work is explicitly theistic in nature, but it is actively critical of the major religions, which is unique for the time. Some have claimed that Yacob was a Christian, and while he's clearly basing his beliefs on something of a Christian worldview, he is actively critical of Christianity in addition to other religions, and evidence for the claim that he was a Christian is probably spurious. The treatise tells the story of his life, how he fled persecution and lived in a cave contemplating religion and philosophy. The epistemic journey that he describes is similar to that of Descartes' meditations, attempting to prove his theistic beliefs from the ground up and discard anything that could not be justified. Yacob does claim to have had these ideas before Descartes' work was published. He claims to have been in the cave and thought about these things before Descartes' work was published. But he didn't publish them himself until a little bit after the meditations were out there. So it's definitely possible that some of the ideas were drawn from Descartes, but it's unlikely due to the lack of kind of speed of travel of ideas across the Mediterranean and Sahara Desert at that point in time that these made it all the way to him. But it's possible. At the very least, though, Yacob did predate a number of other early modern philosophers in his ideas due to the publishing date of his work. He starts with a version of the cosmological argument to defend a belief in God, claiming that we may come from our parents, but if you go back far enough, there must be something that caused itself. However, he questions the correctness of individual religions and holy texts, using an argument that Western philosophy wouldn't really see until nearly 100 years later in Hume's Of Miracles. Basically, the argument that Yacob presents is that there is a disagreement between faiths about the truth of particular holy texts, miracles, or prophets. All religions have their holy text that says a set of things, and they disagree about what those rules and things you should do are. They all have their own miracles that they can point to. They all have their own prophets they can point to. There's a disagreement about that. And none of these arguments are more justified than any other argument. They all can point to big miracles, or they all can point to specific rules that you should follow and reasons for those rules. What Yacob concludes from this is that therefore they're all false, as they're not the product of God, but really the product of humans. Rather, according to Yacob, God has endowed humans with reason, and therefore intends us to use it to see through all of these charlatans that are professing religion. Basically, if God wanted us to believe in such things, he would not present us with equally unjustified alternatives. Therefore, he must want us to use our reason to doubt and critique them all. If God gave us reason, clearly we should use that to see through all of these falsehoods and see the fact that they're all unjustified and have no grounding in truth. This structure of argument is used to draw a number of conclusions. It's built on the conclusion of the cosmological argument that we were created by something, God, and the assumption that we were created with a purpose. Basically, we're created in a certain way. God created us that way because he wanted us to act based on his creation. Therefore, we should act according to how we were created. So, using a couple really simple ideas, namely that God exists and God created us to act according to the way we were created, we can draw a lot of conclusions about how we should act in the world simply by examining how we are. So we see this, for example, with the idea of using the fact that we are rational and intelligent to justify using that intellect against those that claim to know the Word of God, namely religions. However, he uses this to draw other conclusions as well, many of which are critical and skeptical of a lot of the claims presented by religions. So Yacob argues against polygamy because he notes that there are about equal numbers of men and women. Therefore, God probably wants us to pair up. He argues against fasting and specific prohibitions on food advocated for by many religions, as these are not in line with human bodies, which need food to survive and crave things like bacon. He uses a similar argument to address the problem of evil and argue for an afterlife. Basically, it goes like this. Wrongs are not righted in the world. Evil exists. God created a world where wrongs are righted because God is all good. Therefore, an afterlife where wrongs are righted must exist because God exists, which is the one premise that he's using in the big long lever he's using is this style of argument to move the world, as it were. Yacob also uses the claim that all men are equal in front of God to justify a critique of exclusivist religions, quite similar to a critique I offered in a video a few weeks ago. Basically, he claims that our intellect and reason lead us to conclude that no man is better or more intelligent than any other. We can see this through basic intellect and rationality, that no man is better than any other man. And yes, he's using the term man here. There's a lot of sexism that goes quite a ways back. There's no one ethnic group that's better than any others, or that any one ethnic group has privileged access to the Word of God. Now, this is significant because this is a step that Western philosophy didn't take till much later. Therefore, religions such as Christianity, Judaism, etc., that say that there were a particular chosen people of God that use anything from the Old Testament, do not have special access to the right things to do, as this would be discriminatory. So, both from the perspective of their holy texts are problematic because they're saying that one ethnic group has some privileged access to the Word of God and one ethnic group is the chosen people of God, because that's discriminatory, and because we can see through our reason that God gave us to discover these things that everyone's pretty much intelligent and smart and able to reason themselves, or all ethnic groups are, we can see that there's not really a chosen ethnic group. And so, all of these people that are preaching that they're the chosen ethnic group are tricksters and charlatans, and it's a product of humans, not a product of God. He also says that you can't have anyone that has special access to the right things to do if those are certain rites or certain practices or certain days that you have to keep holy and so on and so forth, because that would be discriminatory. And God gave us all of the tools, no matter where we were born, to have access to heaven or a good afterlife. And so if there's certain rules that you would have to learn, then God didn't give us those tools. And so those rules are probably nonsense. To avoid discrimination, anyone must be able to know God, and therefore reason is the only way to get to God, not through holy texts and not through organized religion. It's noteworthy that many of these ideas were presented by European philosophers, but years after, or almost contemporaneously with Jacob's work. Kant would make similar arguments about the necessity of the afterlife based on our ideas about morality about a century after Jacob wrote. Additionally, the idea that all men are equal is often attributed to Locke, the Declaration of Independence, and then Locke, though Locke published these works 20 years after Jacob's work was published. Additionally, Jacob, unlike Kant, Locke, Hume, Hegel, and others, explicitly calls out the problematic nature of racial and ethnic discrimination when critiquing the idea that God might bestow knowledge or ability only on a chosen ethnic group or people. While Kant, Locke, Hume, Hegel, and others argued for explicit racial hierarchies to be put into their philosophy, it would not be until centuries later that Western philosophers would get rid of those theories of racial hierarchies, and arguably there's still remnants of them around today. Does this mean that we should throw out the works of Locke, Hume, and Kant as simply copycats? Probably not. The time that it took for these works to make their way from Ethiopia to Europe and be translated there was substantial, and there was an ensuing controversy when the European that brought the texts attempted to claim them for his own. Subsequent analysis have found that his understanding of the language, based on his other writings in that language, was far too rudimentary to create these works, and the drastically different styles, though not ideas, present in Heywat and Jacob's work, while they are internally consistent within the works, are sufficiently different to say that these must have been written by two separate authors, and so it's very unlikely that one individual European who had a very rudimentary understanding of the language wrote these two very different complex texts. Additionally, the works of these Europeans are important due to their eventual influence on the future of philosophy. So, beyond the question of them copying Jacob or them copying these ideas, the works of Locke, Hume, Kant, blah, 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 were very influential on the course of history and the future of philosophy, even if they weren't the first to have those ideas. However, there is something to be said for teaching Jacob in addition to these other philosophers as a separate and unique perspective, in part because he came earlier, and in part because he went further than these philosophers did, particularly in the realm of arguing that all men are created equal in a deep way that didn't give in to kind of racial animus and ethnic hierarchies that weren't abolished in the West for many years. So, with all that said, I've got some concerns. In terms of the arguments themselves, there are two types of criticisms that may be launched. First, from the perspective of the skeptic, these arguments are unconvincing, as the initial claim that God exists fails to be justified. There are a range of objections that I and others have leveled against the cosmological argument, and Jacob's version is not particularly immune to any of them. However, Jacob's contribution to the literature is not in his unique proof of the existence of God, but rather his conclusions on the basis of God's existence. So, Stepping into the second type of objection, if we, as good indirect skeptics, assume that he is correct that God exists, there are still plenty of holes that can be poked in his arguments and can be shown to lead to some contradictions that might lead us to deny our original assumption. First, in response to Jacob's objections to the problem of evil, if we are to read God's intentions into the features of people, it seems that the most apt conclusion is that God is evil, or at least morally questionable, as people are generally not wholly good. Even if you take the cosmological argument as a proof of God's existence, his goodness is particularly in doubt, especially if we are to base our understanding of God's intentions on the activities of people, who are often quite evil. Jacob needs to prove the claim that God is all good and that he created us with some kind of intentionality, before he can show that the afterlife is the best explanation for evil in the world, as opposed to just God being evil, or at best, God being something like a human that's some days evil, some days good. As for his arguments about monogamy and fasting, even if we assume that looking at the world to understand God's plan is a good way to know what to do, the existing evidence determines what conclusions we should draw. Perhaps God created an equal number of men and women so that half of the men could kill the other half and each take 2 wives. Perhaps he intended everyone to be in polyamorous relationships with 2 men and 2 women. Perhaps he intended everyone to just be gay. It's unclear, simply based on the fact that there are equal numbers of men and women, exactly what, if there was a creator to create those things, what that creator created those equal numbers of men and women to do. With fasting, a similar argument can be posed. If God did not want us to do things that could temporarily hurt our bodies, maybe we shouldn't exercise too much, because that temporarily hurts our body, in the same way that fasting does. Maybe we shouldn't drink alcohol. And that's going to lead into some of those specific prohibitions on consumption of things that Jacob's going to have a bit of a problem with, even though you might be able to come to those conclusions on your own. And it's concerning that these rough and unclear guidelines can give rise to very divergent ethical imperatives, because Jacob's going to try to say we can base all of this in rationality. You can figure it out on your own. You don't need a church or a religion to tell you what you should do. If we're saying that, we need some kind of rationale proof for any of these kinds of things. And so if we're saying that fasting isn't something good because it hurts your body, it's unclear exactly where that line can be drawn. Finally, he justifies the claim that all men are created equal by arguing that unequal treatment or discrimination is imperfect. God is perfect, so God does not want us to do this. However, it's unclear that unequal treatment is always going to be imperfect. As we've talked about before, there may be some privileges or some advantages that are justified, in the sense of equity as opposed to equality. One might think of Aristotle's example of Milo the wrestler that needs more food, or more abstractly, someone that's in poverty may need to be given more to survive than someone that's wealthy. In fact, there are many situations where we think that discrimination is warranted. You're generally considered to be allowed to choose the best candidate for a job, even if they are only the best candidate because they are smarter than the other candidates. So there's some concerns here that we may actually want a morality that allows for some equity as opposed to equality. Now, of course, Jacob could bite the bullet here and say that no discrimination is justified. Equal, equal, equal. But then you have concerns around Harrison Bergeron and so on. That was Ethiopian Philosophy. I highly encourage you to read the works of Zara Yacob and Walda Heywat. Like I said, they're not that long, and they're very interesting to provide some context for what African thinkers were coming up with before some of their European counterparts. Next up, we're going to be finishing this series looking at Pan-Africanism. Thank you for watching this series on analyzing African philosophy. Watch this video and more here at Carneades.org, and stay skeptical, everybody.